Section 1. The Genesis of a Steel Behemoth. The story of the Panzerkampfwagen. 6 Tiger, a name that would echo through the annals of military history, with a mixture of awe and trepidation, does not begin on the battlefields of 1942, but rather in the minds of engineers and strategists years earlier, in a time of uneasy peace and escalating technological ambition. The year was 1937, a period when the world was unknowingly on the precipice of a global conflict that would redefine the very nature of warfare. German military planners, having observed the burgeoning development of heavily armored vehicles by other European powers, particularly France and the Soviet Union, recognized a looming gap in their own armored doctrine. The panzer divisions, the swift and sharp tip of the blitzkrieg spear, were built around speed and maneuverability, relying on light and medium tanks to punch through enemy lines and sow chaos in the rear. However, the strategists foresaw scenarios where this swiftness would be blunted by fortifications and by enemy tanks that could absorb the punishment of their smaller caliber guns and return fire with devastating effect. The call went out for a heavy breakthrough tank, a Durchbruchswagen, capable of withering any fire directed at it and eliminating any obstacle, armored or otherwise, that stood in its path. The initial development was a slow and methodical process, marked by competing designs and shifting requirements. The early encounters on the Eastern Front in 1941 acted as a powerful catalyst, accelerating the program with a newfound sense of urgency. German tank crews, accustomed to technological superiority, were shocked by the resilience of the Soviet T-34 and the sheer imperviousness of the KV-1 heavy tank. The standard guns on the Panzer III and Panzer IV were often found wanting, their shells harmlessly glancing off the sloped and thick armor of these new adversaries. A weapon was needed that could not only match these threats, but dominate them, a machine that could restore the technological and psychological edge that the Wehrmacht had come to expect. This urgency culminated in the formal adoption of the design submitted by the Henschel Company in the summer of 1942. Christened the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger Ausführung H, it was a vehicle that embodied a distinct philosophy of armored warfare: quality over quantity, invincibility over expediency. It was, in every sense, an engineering marvel for its time, a concentration of the most advanced industrial capabilities Germany could muster. At its heart were two features that defined its legendary status: its armor and its main armament. The armor was a formidable shell of high-quality, rolled homogeneous steel. The frontal plate of the hull was 100 millimeters thick, a sheer, unsloped wall of metal designed to shatter incoming projectiles through brute force. The turret front was even thicker, and the sides, at 80 millimeters, were nearly impenetrable to the majority of Allied and Soviet anti-tank weapons of the period. This protective cocoon, weighing a colossal 57 tons, gave its 5-man crew a sense of security that was almost unparalleled on the battlefield. The crew consisted of a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a radio operator, each a highly trained specialist entrusted with the operation of this expensive and complex war machine. But if the armor was the Tiger's shield, its sword was the 88 millimeter Kampfwagen Kanone 36 L56. This cannon was a direct descendant of one of the most feared artillery pieces of the war, the 88 millimeter Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun. Renowned for its flat trajectory, high muzzle velocity, and incredible accuracy, the 88 had already proven its worth in an anti-tank role in North Africa and on the Eastern Front. Mounting it within the confines of a tank turret was a stroke of genius. It transformed the Tiger from a mere heavy tank into a long-range predator. The gunner, peering through the superb Zeiss optics, could confidently engage and neutralize targets at distances well over 1,000 meters, sometimes even approaching 2,000 meters. At these ranges, the Tiger was effectively immune to return fire from the vast majority of its opponents. The first operational deployment of these steel giants came in August of 1942, near the besieged city of Leningrad. This initial taste of combat was fraught with difficulties. The marshy, unforgiving terrain was ill-suited for such a heavy machine, and several of the new tanks suffered from mechanical breakdowns before they even saw significant action. It was a baptism by fire that highlighted the machine's teething problems and its demanding nature. Yet, despite these early setbacks, the potential was clear. The few Tigers that did engage the enemy demonstrated their immense power. Subsequent deployments in the arid landscapes of Tunisia, and, most famously, during the colossal tank battles of the Kursk salient, cemented the Tiger's reputation. It became a specter haunting the thoughts of Allied tank crews, a symbol of German technological prowess that seemed almost supernatural in its capabilities. The production of such a machine, however, was a monumental undertaking. The process was more akin to crafting a fine watch than mass-producing a tool of war. Each Tiger required an estimated 300,000 man-hours to complete, a staggering investment of skilled labor and resources. The intricate transmission, the powerful Maybach engine, the precisely machined gun, and the massive armor plates all had to be assembled with painstaking care. This meticulous construction process, combined with the strategic bombing campaigns waged by the Allies against German industrial centers and the growing scarcity of high-quality steel and other raw materials, meant that the Tiger would always be a rare beast. From its production start in August of 1942 until the assembly lines fell silent 2 years later, in August of 1944, only 1,347 Tiger I tanks were ever built. This number, while significant, pales in comparison to the industrial output of the nations it was designed to intimidate. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a titan of the battlefield, but its very creation sowed the seeds of its own strategic irrelevance. The philosophy of a few, perfect weapons was about to collide with a very different doctrine, one forged not in the precision engineering workshops of Kassel, but in the roaring, ceaseless production lines of Detroit. The Tiger was an apex predator, but it was being released into a world where the ecosystem was about to be flooded with a resilient, adaptable, and almost numberless species. The stage was set for a confrontation not just between two types of tanks, but between two fundamentally opposed philosophies of modern industrial warfare. Section 2. The Arsenal of Democracy and the Pragmatic Sherman. While German engineers were painstakingly crafting their steel Leviathan, a fundamentally different approach to armored warfare was taking shape across the Atlantic Ocean. In the United States, the entry into the Second World War acted as a colossal catalyst, transforming the nation's immense industrial base into what would be famously known as the arsenal of democracy. The American philosophy of war production was not driven by the pursuit of a single, technologically perfect weapon, but by the relentless logic of mass production, logistical efficiency, and overwhelming numbers. At the heart of this philosophy was the medium tank M4, more commonly and enduringly known as the Sherman. To understand the Sherman is to understand the American way of war. It was not conceived to be the most powerful, the most heavily armored, or the most feared tank on the battlefield. It was designed to be good enough, and, crucially, to be available in vast, seemingly inexhaustible quantities. The design of the Sherman, which began in 1940, prioritized reliability, ease of maintenance, and speed of manufacture above all else. Its designers understood that a complex, groundbreaking tank, sitting in a workshop with a broken transmission, was infinitely less useful than a simpler, reliable tank that was actually on the front lines, fighting. The Sherman was a masterpiece of pragmatism. Its chassis was straightforward. Its Continental radial engine was a derivative of an existing aircraft engine, ensuring that mechanics were already somewhat familiar with its workings, and many of its components were standardized to simplify repairs and the supply chain. This approach had a profound impact on its production figures. While the Germans spent months meticulously assembling a single Tiger, American factories, utilizing the revolutionary assembly line techniques pioneered by the automotive industry, were able to produce Shermans at a breathtaking rate. A single Sherman tank required approximately 25,000 man-hours to build, less than 1/10 of the time demanded by its German counterpart. This staggering efficiency meant that for every one Tiger that rolled off the Henschel production line, the Allies could, in theory, field more than 10, and in practice, many more Shermans. The final production numbers tell the story in stark, undeniable terms. Against the 1,347 Tiger Is, the United States alone produced over 49,000 M4 Shermans in all its various modifications. This represents a numerical superiority of more than 35-1 in terms of total production. In specific campaigns, particularly in the latter stages of the war, the localized ratios on the battlefield could be even more skewed, sometimes approaching the 50-1 figure that would come to define the lopsided nature of these armored encounters. The cost of these vehicles further illustrates the chasm between the two production philosophies. A Tiger I cost the German war effort approximately 250,000 Reichsmarks, a fortune reserved for an elite weapon. In contrast, a Sherman M4 cost the American taxpayer around $45,000. Even accounting for exchange rates and economic differences, the Sherman was 5 to 6 times cheaper than the Tiger. This meant that the Allies could afford to lose Shermans in combat. A neutralized Sherman, while a loss for its crew and a tactical setback, was a statistically manageable event. A new tank and often a new crew could be brought up to the front within days, sometimes even hours. The loss of a Tiger, however, was a strategic blow. It represented a massive sunk cost in terms of resources, manufacturing time, and the highly trained, almost irreplaceable crew that operated it. The Sherman was not without its flaws, a fact its crews knew all too well. Its initial 75mm gun lacked the velocity to reliably penetrate the Tiger's thick frontal armor at standard combat ranges. Its own armor, while adequate against lighter German tanks and anti-tank guns, was notoriously vulnerable to the Tiger's powerful 88mm cannon. A single, well-placed shot from a Tiger could, and often did, neutralize a Sherman completely. The tank also had a higher profile than many of its contemporaries, making it a larger target, and early models developed an unfortunate reputation for catching fire when hit, a grim characteristic that led to various nicknames from both Allied and enemy soldiers. Yet, to focus solely on a one-on-one comparison is to miss the point of the Sherman and the doctrine behind it. It was never intended to engage in chivalrous duels with German heavy tanks. The American armored doctrine was based on combined arms and maneuver warfare. A Sherman platoon encountering a Tiger was not expected to charge it head-on. Instead, their training emphasized using their superior numbers and mobility to their advantage. 1 or 2 Shermans would engage the Tiger from the front, firing to distract its gunner and obscure its vision with smoke and high-explosive shells. While the Tiger was preoccupied, the other Shermans in the platoon would use their speed to execute flanking maneuvers, racing to get a shot at the Tiger's thinner side or rear armor, where their 75mm guns were far more effective. Furthermore, the Sherman was part of a larger, interconnected web of military power. A tank crew that found itself outmatched could use its radio, a standard and reliable piece of equipment in every American tank, to call for help. This help could come in the form of artillery barrages that could track the slow-moving Tiger, or force its crew to button up, drastically reducing their visibility. Or, most devastatingly, it could come from the air. The Allies' overwhelming air superiority meant that fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt were often circling overhead, ready to be called down to deliver rockets and bombs with pinpoint accuracy. The Sherman, therefore, was more than just a tank. It was a node in a vast, flexible, and responsive military network. It was a reliable, mass-produced tool wielded by well-supplied armies that controlled the skies and had a deep bench of replacements for both men and machines. The German Tiger was a finely honed rapier, deadly in the hands of a master, but fragile and difficult to replace. The American Sherman was a cudgel, simple and unassuming, but there was always another one, and another one after that, ready to be swung. The impending clash in the fields and forests of Europe would not be a simple test of which tank was better, but a brutal examination of which industrial and strategic philosophy was more sound for winning a prolonged, attritional total war. Section 3. The Predator's Debut and the Birth of a Myth. When the Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger first rumbled onto the battlefields, it was less a weapon and more a force of nature. Its arrival was a profound shock to Allied and Soviet forces, a sudden and terrifying escalation in the ongoing arms race. The initial deployments on the Eastern Front near Leningrad in late 1942 were, from a purely operational standpoint, a mixed success. The 57-ton machines struggled in the swampy terrain, and their complex mechanics proved susceptible to failure in the harsh conditions. More than one of these precious new tanks was lost, not to enemy fire, but to mechanical failure and the inability to recover them from the mud. However, for the tank crews who faced them, these teething problems were irrelevant. What mattered was the chilling sight of their own anti-tank rounds, from both infantry guns and their own T-34 tanks, striking the Tiger's thick hide and bouncing off in a shower of sparks, having no effect whatsoever. In return, the Tiger's 88mm gun would speak with a flat, authoritative crack, and a Soviet tank hundreds of meters away would be engulfed in a plume of smoke and fire, its combat effectiveness instantly nullified. The psychological impact of this apparent invulnerability was immense, far outweighing the initial tactical setbacks. The legend of the Tiger had begun to grow. It was in the sun-scorched hills and dusty plains of Tunisia in early 1943 that the Tiger truly announced its arrival on the world stage. Deployed to bolster the beleaguered Africa Corps, the heavy tanks of the 501st and 504th Heavy Panzer Battalions made an immediate and dramatic impression on the American and British forces. At engagements like the Battle of Sidi Bouzid and the Kasserine Pass, small numbers of Tigers were able to dominate the battlefield, acting as mobile fortresses that anchored the German defensive lines. Allied tank crews in their M3 Grants and the newly arrived M4 Shermans found themselves in a terrifyingly disadvantageous position. Their guns, effective at 500 meters against German medium tanks, were all but useless against the Tiger's frontal armor. To have any chance of success, they had to close the distance to a few hundred meters, a suicidal proposition against a tank that could accurately and lethally engage them from well over a kilometer away. Reports from the front were filled with a sense of disbelief. A single Tiger could hold a key crossroads or a valley pass against a company of Allied tanks, methodically neutralizing them one by one, seemingly at its leisure. The sound of the Tiger's 88mm gun became a dreaded harbinger of doom. Its high-velocity shell traveled faster than the speed of sound, meaning that Allied crews would often witness the impact on a friendly vehicle before they even heard the report of the gun that fired it. This created a feeling of helplessness and contributed to a phenomenon that became known as Tiger phobia. Every unidentified German tank on the horizon was suspected of being a Tiger. The long-barreled Panzer IV, a far more common and less dangerous opponent, was frequently misidentified, leading to panicked reports and overly cautious tactical decisions. The German command, well aware of the psychological power of their new weapon, capitalized on this. They concentrated their few Tiger battalions at critical points in the line, using them as fire brigades to stamp out Allied breakthroughs and stiffen the resolve of their own infantry. This practice further enhanced the tank's fearsome reputation, as it always seemed to appear where the fighting was thickest and where its impact would be most profound. The myth of the Tiger was further solidified by the emergence of a new breed of warrior, the Panzer Ace. These were the highly skilled and experienced commanders and gunners of the Tiger tanks, men who learned to exploit the vehicle's strengths to their absolute fullest. Names like Michael Wittmann, Otto Carius, and Kurt Knispel became legendary, credited with destroying dozens, and in some cases over 100 enemy armored vehicles. These aces were masters of their craft. They understood the importance of positioning, using the terrain to conceal their massive vehicle and create favorable engagement corridors. They were experts in long-range gunnery, able to calculate the lead and drop for targets over a mile away. They possessed an unshakable coolness under pressure, calmly selecting targets and directing their crew's actions while enemy shells clanged harmlessly against their armor. One of the most famous examples of a Tiger's devastating potential occurred on June 13, 1944, shortly after the D-Day landings, near the French village of Villers-Bocage. In a stunning display of individual skill and mechanical superiority, SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a single Tiger, ambushed a column of the British 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats. In a period of about 15 minutes, Wittmann's Tiger rampaged through the British column, neutralizing approximately 14 tanks, numerous carriers and other vehicles, effectively halting a major British advance single-handedly. This action, while an outlier in its astonishing success, was broadcast by German propaganda and became the quintessential example of the Tiger's power. It reinforced the narrative of the superior German warrior in his superior machine, a lone hero capable of defeating an entire enemy formation. It was a powerful and compelling story. However, this focus on individual tank versus tank engagements and the celebrated exploits of aces, while making for dramatic headlines, obscured a more complex and troubling reality. The Tiger was indeed a master of the tactical duel, a king on the chessboard of the battlefield. But war is not a series of duels. It is a grinding, all-encompassing struggle of industry, logistics, and attrition. While the aces were racking up impressive tallies, the fundamental weaknesses of the Tiger, its mechanical fragility, its prodigious fuel consumption, and its excruciatingly slow production rate, were beginning to exert their inexorable influence on the broader strategic situation. The myth of the Tiger, born in the mud of Russia and forged in the deserts of Africa, was a powerful psychological weapon, but it was a myth that was about to be tested against the cold, hard arithmetic of total industrial war. The legend was impressive, but legends alone do not win wars. Section 4. The Weight of Victory, the Tiger's Logistical Nightmare. For all its formidable armor and devastating firepower, the Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger carried within its 57-ton frame the seeds of its own undoing. Its greatest strengths were inextricably linked to its most debilitating weaknesses. The very design philosophy that made it a peerless battlefield predator also rendered it a logistical nightmare, a high-maintenance thoroughbred in a war that increasingly demanded resilient workhorses. The immense weight of the Tiger was the root cause of many of its problems. This colossal mass, necessary to support the thick armor plates and the heavy 88mm gun, placed an almost unbearable strain on its mechanical components. The Maybach HL-230 engine, a 700-horsepower gasoline engine, was a marvel of engineering, but it was operating at the very limit of its performance to move the tank's bulk. This led to frequent overheating and a high risk of engine fires if not meticulously maintained. More problematic was the transmission and steering system. The Tiger employed a sophisticated hydraulic transmission that, while giving it surprising agility for its size, was complex and prone to failure. The final drives, the gears that transferred power to the tracks, were notoriously overstressed and were a common point of mechanical breakdown. A Tiger crew heading into combat lived with the constant, nagging fear that their invincible fortress might be immobilized not by an enemy shell, but by a simple, mechanical failure. On the fluid battlefields of the Second World War, an immobilized tank was often as good as a destroyed one. If it could not be repaired on the spot, it required a specialized recovery vehicle, typically an 18-ton Famo half-track. Often, 2 or even 3 of these powerful vehicles were needed to tow a single disabled Tiger, a process that was slow, dangerous, and consumed vast quantities of fuel. If the recovery could not be made before the front line shifted, the crew had no choice but to abandon their prized machine, often after disabling it to prevent its capture. Countless Tigers were lost in this ignominious fashion, victims of their own mechanical frailty. Transportation outside the immediate combat zone presented another set of monumental challenges. The Tiger's combat tracks were a staggering 725 millimeters wide, designed to distribute its weight and prevent it from bogging down in soft ground. However, this width made it too wide for most European railway tunnels and platforms. Consequently, before being transported by rail, a Tiger crew had to undertake the laborious process of removing the wide combat tracks and fitting a narrower set of transport tracks. This process could take hours and required the use of heavy lifting equipment. Upon arrival at their destination, the entire process had to be reversed. This made the strategic relocation of Tiger units a slow and resource-intensive affair, robbing them of the operational flexibility enjoyed by lighter vehicles. The tank's weight also severely restricted its tactical mobility. Many smaller bridges and culverts across Europe simply could not bear the 57-ton load of a Tiger. This forced Tiger commanders to meticulously plan their routes, often making long detours to find suitable river crossings. While the Tiger was designed with a deep wading capability, allowing it to snorkel across rivers, this was a complex and risky procedure that was rarely used under combat conditions. More often than not, the presence of a river without a sturdy bridge was as effective a barrier as an anti-tank ditch. Perhaps the most crippling logistical constraint, especially as the war progressed, was the Tiger's insatiable thirst for fuel. The powerful Maybach engine consumed fuel at an astonishing rate, averaging around 500 liters for every 100 kilometers traveled on roads. Off-road, in difficult terrain, this consumption could easily double. This meant that the Tiger had a very limited operational range and was tethered to a constant and voluminous supply of gasoline. In the early years of the war, this was a manageable problem. But by 1944, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was systematically dismantling Germany's synthetic fuel production facilities, and the Red Army was capturing the vital oil fields in the east. Fuel became an increasingly precious commodity. German panzer divisions found their movements dictated not by strategic objectives, but by the location of the nearest fuel dump. There are numerous accounts from the Battle of the Bulge and the final defensive battles inside Germany, where entire units of Tigers, and the even heavier King Tigers, were rendered impotent, not by enemy action, but simply because they ran out of fuel. They were abandoned by their crews, becoming nothing more than static steel monuments to a logistical system in a state of total collapse. The complexity of the Tiger also meant that repairs were a specialist job. Unlike the Sherman, which was designed with interchangeable parts and ease of maintenance in mind, the Tiger required highly trained mechanics and specialized equipment. A simple transmission replacement could take days of work in a properly equipped field workshop. These workshops were high-priority targets for Allied air power, and their destruction could cripple a Tiger battalion as effectively as a direct assault. In essence, the Tiger was a weapon system that demanded a perfect logistical ecosystem to function effectively. It required a steady flow of fuel, spare parts, skilled mechanics, heavy recovery vehicles, and secure transportation networks. As the Allied war machine squeezed Germany from the east and the west, this ecosystem crumbled. For every Tiger neutralized by a Sherman's flanking shot or a Thunderbolt's rocket, several more were likely lost to a snapped torsion bar, a failed final drive, or an empty fuel tank. It was a war of attrition, and the Tiger, for all its individual prowess, was an asset that Germany simply could not afford to maintain. It was a champion with a glass jaw, a giant with an Achilles heel, and its vulnerability lay not in its armor, but in the long, fragile supply line that stretched all the way back to a faltering war economy. Section 5. The Normandy Cauldron and the Logic of Attrition. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the end on the Western Front and set the stage for the ultimate confrontation between the two opposing doctrines of armored warfare. The ensuing campaign, fought in the dense, claustrophobic hedgerow country of the Normandy bocage, became a brutal, grinding battle of attrition that perfectly highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of both the Tiger and the Sherman. The bocage was a unique and challenging environment for armored operations. It was a landscape of small fields and sunken lanes, bordered by ancient, thick hedgerows, earthen walls several feet high, overgrown with dense shrubs and trees. This terrain broke up the sweeping, open fields, where the Tiger's long-range gunnery would have been supreme. Instead, it created a maze of short-range ambush alleys, where visibility was often limited to 100 meters or less. For the German defenders, this terrain was a gift. A single, well-sighted Tiger could conceal itself within a break in a hedgerow, its massive form hidden from view, and command a stretch of road or a field. As Allied tanks, predominantly Shermans, advanced cautiously, they would be funneled into a pre-registered kill zone. The Tiger's commander would wait until the lead Sherman was at point-blank range before giving the order to fire. The result was often swift and decisive. The Sherman would be neutralized, often blocking the path of the vehicles behind it and creating a perfect bottleneck for the Tiger's gunner to exploit. In these localized, defensive engagements, the Tiger was in its element, and it exacted a heavy toll on the advancing Allied armored columns. However, these tactical victories, while costly for the Allies, could not halt the relentless tide. The Allied strategy in Normandy was built upon the foundation of their overwhelming numerical superiority. For every Tiger the Germans could commit to a sector, the Allies could bring to bear dozens of Shermans. While the loss of a Sherman crew was a tragedy, the loss of the tank itself was a manageable, anticipated cost of doing business. The Allied logistical chain was a marvel of efficiency. Damaged Shermans were quickly recovered, repaired in vast, well-stocked field workshops just behind the lines, and returned to service, sometimes within 24 hours. Completely neutralized tanks were simply replaced by new ones, drawn from the enormous reserves that had been landed on the Normandy beaches. The German situation was the polar opposite. Every Tiger lost was an almost irreplaceable asset. Spare parts were scarce, recovery was perilous under the constant threat of Allied air attack, and there were no new tanks waiting in reserve to fill the gaps. The German heavy panzer battalions were slowly, but surely, being ground down. The Sherman crews, though keenly aware of their tank's vulnerability, quickly adapted their tactics to the deadly realities of the bocage. They learned to work in teams, a concept drilled into them through rigorous training. Upon encountering a suspected German heavy tank, They would employ a tactic known as cat and mouse. One Sherman would move forward, firing its main gun, not necessarily with armor-piercing rounds, but with high explosive or smoke shells. The goal was not to destroy the Tiger, but to force its crew to button up, to obscure its vision, and to keep its turret pointed in one direction. While the Tiger was thus engaged, other Shermans would use the cover of the hedgerows and sunken lanes to maneuver onto its flanks. The Sherman's speed and agility, often underestimated, were critical in these moments. Once a Sherman crew got a shot at the Tiger's 80mm side armor at close range, the odds shifted dramatically in their favor. Their 75mm gun was more than capable of penetrating it, and a successful hit could disable the beast. Furthermore, the Allies wielded a weapon that the Germans had no effective counter for: total air supremacy. The skies over Normandy belonged to the Allied air forces. Fighter bombers like the American P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Hawker Typhoon circled menacingly over the battlefield, acting as the eyes and ears of the ground forces. Sherman commanders could use their radios to call in air support on any stubborn point of resistance. For a Tiger crew, the drone of an approaching Jaebuschreck, fighter-bomber fear, was a terrifying sound. Caught in the open, the massive, slow-moving Tiger was an easy target for rockets and bombs. Even a near miss from a 500-pound bomb could be enough to damage its sensitive suspension, or tracks, rendering it immobile. The constant threat from the Air Force German tank movements to be restricted to the hours of darkness or during periods of bad weather, severely limiting their operational flexibility. As the campaign wore on, the relentless pressure began to tell. A Tiger might neutralize 3, 5, or even 10 Shermans in a single engagement, but there were always more Shermans. The surviving Allied crews would regroup, draw a replacement tank, and press the attack again the next day. The Tiger crew, on the other hand, would be low on ammunition, low on fuel, and their machine would be one step closer to its next inevitable mechanical failure. It was a war of numbers, a brutal mathematical equation that had only one possible outcome. The individual duels might be won by the Tiger, but the battle of attrition was being won by the Sherman. The Normandy campaign was a microcosm of the entire war on the Western Front. It demonstrated that a tactically superior weapon is ultimately useless if it is outnumbered, outsupplied, and unable to cope with the relentless, grinding pressure of a foe with a seemingly infinite capacity to absorb losses and continue the fight. The hedgerows of Normandy became a graveyard for many of Germany's elite panzer divisions, their prized Tigers neutralized not just by enemy fire, but by the simple, inescapable logic of industrial warfare. Section 6. The human element. Inside the steel beasts. Beyond the cold statistics of armor thickness and muzzle velocity, the confrontation between the Tiger and the Sherman was a profoundly human experience, shaped by the vastly different psychological environments inside each vehicle. For the 5 men who comprised the crew of a Tiger tank, their world was one of perceived invincibility, immense pressure, and a constant, gnawing anxiety about the machine's fragility. To be assigned to a Tiger was to be considered part of an elite. The crews were often hand-picked veterans, men who had proven their skill and courage on other fronts. Climbing into their 57-ton fortress, they were enveloped by an almost tangible sense of security. The thick steel walls around them were a testament to German engineering, a promise of protection against the enemy's wrath. Looking through the commander's cupola, or the gunner's sight, they knew they possessed a weapon that could dominate the battlefield, capable of reaching out and touching an enemy tank from a distance where they themselves were untouchable. This engendered a powerful sense of confidence, a belief that they were the masters of their domain. This confidence, however, was a double-edged sword. The Tiger was a precious national asset, and the pressure to perform, to achieve results worthy of such a magnificent machine, was immense. Every decision made by the commander was weighed against the catastrophic cost of losing the tank. The exploits of the Panzer Aces, celebrated by the propaganda machine, created an expectation of spectacular success that was difficult to live up to. The daily reality for a Tiger crew was often less about heroic charges and more about a constant battle with their own vehicle. The cramped interior was filled with the heat and fumes of the Maybach engine. The ride was rough, and the noise was deafening, making communication a matter of shouting through the intercom system. And always, there was the fear of a breakdown. The sickening lurch of a failed transmission, the sudden silence of a stalled engine, or the sharp crack of a snapped torsion bar could instantly transform their mobile fortress into a static, vulnerable target. A Tiger crew stranded deep in enemy territory faced a grim choice: attempt to make repairs under fire or abandon and destroy the most powerful tank in the world. This created a unique form of stress, a reliance not just on their fighting skill, but on the temperamental spirit of the machine they inhabited. The world inside an M4 Sherman was entirely different. A Sherman crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and co-driver, bow gunner, harbored no illusions of invincibility. They knew their tank was a compromise, a jack of all trades, but a master of none. They were acutely aware that a direct, frontal confrontation with a Tiger was a losing proposition. Their armor was thin. Their gun was, for much of the war, underpowered against heavy German armor, and their high profile made them an easy target. This knowledge fostered a different kind of mindset, one built not on a sense of superiority, but on caution, teamwork, and a reliance on the broader combined arms system. Where the Tiger crew's confidence came from their tank's individual power, the Sherman crew's confidence came from their numbers and their support network. They knew that they were not alone. To their left and right were other Shermans, their comrades, ready to execute a flanking maneuver or lay down covering fire. On their radio, they had a direct line to artillery batteries that could blanket an enemy position with high explosives. Above them, the ever-present drone of Allied aircraft was a comforting reminder that the most powerful weapon on the battlefield was often not a tank at all. Life inside the Sherman was, in some ways, less demanding than in the Tiger. The vehicle was known for its mechanical reliability. It started when you needed it to, and it kept running. The ride was smoother, thanks to its vertical volute spring suspension system. Maintenance was simpler, and crews often became adept at performing minor repairs themselves. This reliability bred a certain trust between man and machine. A Sherman crew might not believe their tank could win a one-on-one duel, but they believed it would get them to the battle and, with some luck and smart tactics, get them back. The psychological dynamic of an engagement was a study in contrasts. The Tiger gunner, peering through his superior optics, felt like a hunter, patiently waiting for his prey to enter the crosshairs. The Sherman gunner often felt like the prey, scanning the horizon for the telltale shape of a German heavy tank, knowing that he might be the target in an enemy's sights he could not even see. The American doctrine emphasized aggression and initiative, but for the Sherman crews on the front line, survival often dictated a more cautious, reactive approach. They became experts at using the terrain for cover, at advancing in short bounds from one hull-down position to another, and at using smoke to blind the enemy. Their greatest weapon was their brain, their ability to outthink and outmaneuver a technologically superior but less flexible opponent. They learned that the goal was not always to destroy the Tiger, but often simply to survive the encounter, to fix its position, and to let other, more powerful assets, artillery and air power, do the heavy lifting. Ultimately, the human experience in these two tanks reflected their strategic roles. The men in the Tiger were specialists, masters of a rare and powerful weapon, but they were also isolated, bearing a heavy burden of expectation and wrestling with a machine that was as much an enemy as the one they faced. The men in the Sherman were cogs in a vast and powerful machine, their individual survivability perhaps lower, but their collective strength, their resilience, and their ability to endlessly reinforce and replace their losses made them part of an unstoppable force. It was the triumph of the dependable collective over the brilliant but brittle individual. Section 7. An evolving battlefield. The Allied technological answer. The Allied command, faced with the tactical problem of the Tiger tank, did not rely solely on the strategy of overwhelming numbers. While the war of attrition was the foundation of their ultimate victory, it was complemented by a concerted effort of technological innovation and adaptation. The appearance of the Tiger and later the Panther on the battlefield spurred a rapid evolution in Allied armor and anti-tank capabilities. The goal was to close the technological gap and give their crews a fighting chance in a direct engagement. The most immediate and effective solution came from the British. Recognizing the limitations of the standard 75mm gun on the Sherman, British engineers undertook a brilliant and audacious modification. They managed to fit their own powerful ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder anti-tank gun into a modified Sherman turret. The result was the Sherman Firefly. The 17-pounder was a magnificent weapon, a long-barreled, high-velocity gun capable of firing an armor-piercing discarding sabot (APDS) round that could penetrate the Tiger's 100mm frontal armor from over 1,000 meters away. The Firefly was, for the first time, a Sherman that could meet a Tiger on something approaching equal terms. It was the Tiger Slayer that Allied crews had been desperately waiting for. The conversion was not without its compromises. The massive gun and its ammunition took up so much space inside the turret that the co-driver's position had to be eliminated, and the cramped interior made for a challenging work environment for the loader. The long barrel was also a conspicuous giveaway of the tank's identity, so crews often resorted to painting the end of the barrel to create the illusion of a standard, shorter 75mm gun, hoping to deceive German gunners until it was too late. British doctrine dictated that each troop of Shermans should include one Firefly. This Firefly would ideally stay back in an overwatch position, letting the standard Shermans draw the enemy's attention before moving in to deliver the decisive, armor-piercing shot. The Firefly played a pivotal role in the Normandy campaign and beyond, providing the essential firepower needed to counter the German heavy panzer battalions. It was, in fact, a Sherman Firefly from the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, commanded by Sergeant Gordon and gunned by Joe Ekins. That is widely credited with the neutralization of Michael Whitman's Tiger on August 8, 1944, a symbolic moment where the Allied adaptation directly overcame the master of the German elite. The Americans also worked to upgrade the Sherman's capabilities. While they were concurrently developing their own heavy tanks like the M26 Pershing, these would not arrive in significant numbers until the very end of the war. The more immediate solution was to improve the Sherman itself. Later production models, such as the M4A3E8, famously nicknamed the Easy 8, featured significant improvements. It was equipped with a new horizontal volute spring suspension (HVSS) system, which provided a much smoother ride and better mobility over rough terrain. More importantly, it was armed with a new, more powerful 76mm high-velocity gun. While this weapon still struggled against the Tiger's frontal armor at long range, it was a marked improvement over the original 75mm gun and gave American crews a much better chance, especially against the Tiger's side armor and against the more numerous Panther medium tank. Beyond tank-on-tank engagements, the most significant technological answer to the Tiger came from the sky. The concept of close air support was honed to a fine art by the Allies. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a perfect example of this. A massive, rugged fighter plane, It was heavily armed with 8 50 caliber machine guns and could carry an impressive payload of 500-pound bombs or high-velocity aircraft rockets. It was, in effect, a flying artillery platform. Pilots of the 9th Air Force, operating from makeshift airfields just behind the front lines, worked in close coordination with ground forces. A system of forward air controllers, often traveling with the armored columns in small vehicles, could communicate directly with the pilots circling overhead. When a Sherman platoon was pinned down by a Tiger, the controller could vector a flight of thunderbolts onto the target's position. For the Tiger crew, the arrival of these aircraft was a terrifying ordeal. The rockets, while not always accurate enough to score a direct hit, could damage the tank's suspension, tracks, or engine with a near miss. A direct hit from a 500-pound bomb was catastrophic. The 50 caliber machine guns, while unable to penetrate the main armor, could shred the tank's external fittings, damage the optics, and, most importantly, force the crew to stay buttoned up, blind, and vulnerable. The British Hawker Typhoon, with its battery of rockets, fulfilled a similar and equally devastating role. This air supremacy fundamentally changed the calculus of armored warfare. It meant that the Tiger could not operate with impunity. It was constantly being watched from above. Every road, every bridge, every wooded copse could be hiding not just an enemy tank, but a far more lethal threat from the air. This forced German units to become more static and defensive, ceding the initiative to the Allies. The combination of these technological advancements, the specialized tank-killing rounds of the Firefly, the upgraded gun of the EZ-8, and the overwhelming power of tactical air support, created a multi-layered response to the Tiger problem. It was a demonstration of the Allied industrial and doctrinal flexibility. They recognized a threat, and through a combination of clever engineering, tactical adaptation, and the leveraging of their asymmetric advantages like air power, they developed effective counters. The battlefield of late 1944 was a far more dangerous place for a Tiger than it had been in 1943. The lone predator was now being hunted by a pack that was not only more numerous, but was also growing sharper teeth and longer claws. Section 8. The Roar of the Forges. A War of Industrial Might. The ultimate story of the Tiger and the Sherman is not one that can be fully understood by examining battlefield tactics or technological specifications alone. It is a story written in the language of steel, coal, and man-hours, a narrative dominated by the colossal, roaring forges of two competing industrial philosophies. The Second World War was, at its core, a total war, a conflict where the factory floor was as crucial a front line as any muddy trench or shattered city. And in this industrial war, the disparity between the Axis and the Allies was perhaps the most decisive factor of all. The German approach to weapons production, exemplified by the Tiger tank, was rooted in a tradition of precision engineering and a pursuit of technological perfection. Each Tiger was a masterpiece, assembled by skilled workers who lavished hundreds of thousands of man-hours on its creation. This resulted in a weapon of incredible quality and capability. However, this focus on quality came at the expense of quantity. The German war economy, already strained by a multi-front war and a growing scarcity of raw materials, simply could not produce these complex machines in the numbers required. Production was further hampered by the relentless Allied strategic bombing campaign. From 1943 onwards, waves of American and British bombers systematically targeted key industrial sites, including the Henschel factories in Kassel, where the Tigers were built. These raids disrupted supply chains, destroyed vital machinery, and created a state of constant interruption. While German industry showed remarkable resilience, the cumulative effect was a throttling of production capacity. The monthly output of Tiger tanks rarely exceeded a few dozen units. This was a trickle, not a flood. On the other side of the Atlantic, the American industrial machine operated on a scale and with a philosophy that was almost incomprehensible to their opponents. Unhindered by aerial bombardment, American factories converted their immense civilian production capacity to military ends with astonishing speed and efficiency. The automotive giants of Detroit, with their decades of experience in mass production and assembly line techniques, became the heart of this arsenal of democracy. Companies like Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors turned their attention from producing sedans and coupes to churning out tanks, planes, and trucks. The M4 Sherman was designed from the outset for this environment. It was a product of a culture that valued volume, efficiency, and standardization. Parts were made to be interchangeable, not just between tanks, but between factories. A hull might be cast at one plant, a turret at another, and the engine built at a third, all coming together at a final assembly plant, like the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. This modular, streamlined approach allowed for a production rate that was nothing short of miraculous. At its peak, the United States was producing thousands of Sherman tanks every month. This industrial avalanche completely altered the strategic landscape. The Germans were fighting a war of conservation, trying to husband their precious few heavy tanks and deploy them only where they could have the maximum impact. The Allies, in contrast, were fighting a war of abundance. They could afford to be aggressive, to take risks, and to accept losses, knowing that their industrial base could replace any losses many times over. When Operation Overlord commenced in June 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy with over 11,000 tanks at their disposal. The German forces defending the Atlantic Wall could muster perhaps 1,000 armored vehicles in response, and of those, only a few dozen were the formidable Tigers. This staggering numerical imbalance was the defining feature of the campaign. By the end of the war, the ratios had become even more extreme. On the Western Front, it was not uncommon for Allied forces to have a 50-to-1 advantage in armored vehicles in a given sector. This meant that a German commander, even with a handful of superior Tiger tanks, was faced with an impossible task. He was not fighting an enemy army. He was fighting an entire industrial civilization. This quantitative superiority had a profound effect on logistics and maintenance. The Allies had a vast and standardized pool of spare parts. If a Sherman's engine failed, a new one could be readily sourced and installed. If the damage was too severe, the tank was simply written off, and a new one was issued. For the Germans, every broken part on a Tiger was a crisis. Spare parts for its complex transmission or overstressed engine were rare, and had to be shipped from factories under constant threat of attack. This industrial might also extended to the training and replacement of crews. The Allies could afford to cycle crews out of the line, providing them with rest and further training. New crews were trained in vast centers in the United States and Britain, using standardized procedures and equipment. Germany, by late 1944, was facing a critical shortage of experienced personnel. The veteran crews who had honed their skills on the Eastern Front and in North Africa were a dwindling resource. New recruits were often rushed to the front with inadequate training, unable to get the most out of their complex machines. In the end, the Tiger became a symbol of Germany's strategic predicament. It was a wonder weapon, born from a desire to substitute technological quality for numerical inferiority. The hope was that a few invincible tanks could turn the tide against the Allied hordes. But this was a fundamental misreading of the nature of modern warfare. The war would not be decided by a handful of spectacular duels between champions. It would be won by the side that could put the most guns, the most tanks, and the most soldiers on the field, and sustain them with an unbreakable chain of supply. The roar of the forges in Detroit and the other industrial heartlands of America was ultimately a more powerful and decisive sound than the crack of any single 88mm gun. The Tiger was a magnificent beast, but it was born into an ecosystem it could not survive. An ecosystem dominated by the relentless, pragmatic, and overwhelming power of mass production. Section 9. The Predator's Twilight. A final feudal. Stand by the autumn and winter of 1944. The once mighty Tiger was entering the twilight of its operational life. The war on the Western Front had become a relentless, westward advance by the Allies, while in the east, the Red Army was pushing inexorably towards the heart of Germany. For the few remaining Tiger crews, the nature of combat had fundamentally changed. The days of triumphant, long-range tank battles in open country were largely over. Now, they were engaged in a desperate, grinding series of defensive actions, fighting for every town, bridge, and crossroads in a slow, agonizing retreat. The very factors that had once made the Tiger so formidable were now compounded into a litany of fatal weaknesses. The most critical issue was the crippling shortage of fuel. Germany's synthetic oil plants lay in ruins from Allied bombing, and the supply of crude oil was a mere trickle. This fuel crisis transformed the Tiger from a mobile weapon of war into a frequently static pillbox. Commanders planned their operations not around tactical objectives, but around the availability of gasoline. Battalions of Tigers, including the even larger and more fuel-hungry Tiger II, or King Tiger, were often rendered completely immobile, their crews forced to wait for precious fuel deliveries that frequently never arrived. An abandoned Tiger, its fuel tanks dry, was a common sight during the final months of the war, a potent symbol of an industrial war machine grinding to a halt. The lack of experienced crews was just as severe. The veteran aces of 1943 and early 1944 were almost all gone, casualties of the attritional fighting in Normandy and on the Eastern Front. They were replaced by young, hastily trained recruits who, while brave, lacked the deep well of experience needed to operate the complex Tiger effectively. They didn't have the gunnery skills to consistently hit targets at extreme range, nor the mechanical empathy to coax a failing transmission into action. These new crews were often overwhelmed by the sheer number of threats they faced. They were not just fighting tanks, they were fighting a complete, three-dimensional battlefield. They had to be constantly vigilant for flanking Shermans, for concealed infantry with handheld anti-tank weapons, for artillery observers calling in a barrage, and, above all, for the ever-present threat of Allied fighter bombers. Under this immense pressure, mistakes were made, and the life expectancy of a new Tiger crew was tragically short. The story of Michael Wittmann's final engagement on August 8, 1944, serves as a powerful allegory for the Tiger's decline. During a German counterattack near the town of Saint-Aignan-de-Crèmesnil, Wittmann's group of Tigers was ambushed by a mixed force of British and Canadian tanks, including several Sherman Fireflies. No longer was it a single Tiger dominating a column of unsuspecting opponents, as at Villers-Bocage. This time, the Tiger was caught in a carefully prepared crossfire. A Sherman Firefly of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, positioned perfectly on the flank, fired a succession of shots. The combined fire from multiple directions overwhelmed the legendary Aces tank. The Tiger, number 007, was neutralized, its formidable career brought to an abrupt end, not by a single champion, but by the coordinated teamwork of several less powerful, but tactically astute, opponents. This engagement demonstrated how the Allies had learned, adapted, and developed an effective counter-doctrine. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 was the Tiger's last major offensive action. Hitler gambled his last armored reserves on a desperate push through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The heavy panzer battalions, with their Tigers and King Tigers, were intended to be the spearhead of this assault. Initially, they achieved some success, their thick armor and powerful guns overwhelming the surprised American defenders. However, the offensive soon bogged down for all the now familiar reasons. The narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes were ill-suited for the massive tanks, creating huge traffic jams. Mechanical breakdowns were rampant in the cold, icy conditions. And, most critically, the German spearheads outran their fuel supplies. When the weather cleared after a few days of overcast skies, the Allied air forces returned with a vengeance, raining destruction on the exposed German armored columns. The offensive collapsed, and the losses in precious, irreplaceable heavy tanks were catastrophic. In the final months of the war, from early 1945 until the surrender in May, the few remaining Tigers were used as mobile defensive assets, shuttled from one crisis point to another. Many were dug into defensive positions, their mechanical issues making them little more than well-armored gun emplacements. When their positions were about to be overrun, their crews would often abandon and scuttle them to prevent their capture. Post-war analysis revealed a startling statistic. A significant majority of Tigers were lost, not in direct combat with other tanks, but due to mechanical failure, lack of fuel, or being abandoned during a retreat. The Predator had become a victim of its own complexity and the collapse of the system designed to support it. The twilight of the Tiger was a slow, ignominious decline, a stark illustration that in a war of total industrial mobilization, even the most powerful weapon cannot survive when its logistical heart is failing. The final silence of its Maybach engine on some forgotten road in Germany was the definitive endnote to a strategy that had prioritized individual perfection over sustainable, overwhelming force. Section 10. A Legacy in Steel. The Verdict of History. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe in May of 1945, the time came for reflection and analysis. In the post-war accounting, the legacy of the Tiger tank was examined not just by military historians, but by the very generals who had fought against it. The consensus that emerged was clear and consistent. The Tiger was a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic folly, a magnificent weapon that had no decisive impact on the outcome of the war. Allied commanders, from platoon leaders to the Supreme Command, held a deep respect for the Tiger's combat capabilities. They acknowledged its thick armor, which had so often rendered their own weapons useless, and its superb 88mm gun, which had dominated engagements from astonishing distances. The tank had earned its fearsome reputation on the battlefield. However, this respect was always tempered by a broader strategic understanding. General Omar Bradley, one of the principal American field commanders, summarized this sentiment perfectly when he noted that the Tiger was a magnificent piece of machinery, but not a machine with which one could win a war. His assessment cut to the core of the issue. A weapon's ultimate value is not measured by its individual performance in a single engagement, but by its overall contribution to the war effort. In this regard, the Tiger failed. The reasons for this failure were manifold, a culmination of all the weaknesses that had plagued it throughout its service life. The production figures alone tell a compelling story. The 1,347 Tiger Is and the 492 of its even larger successor, the Tiger II or King Tiger, were but a drop in the ocean compared to the more than 80,000 medium tanks produced by the United States and Great Britain, and the even greater numbers produced by the Soviet Union. The German war effort was, in essence, trying to defeat a flood with a fire hose. The Tiger was part of a broader German pattern of pursuing wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, in the latter stages of the war. From advanced jet fighters to long-range rockets, the hope was that a technological leap could compensate for overwhelming numerical inferiority. The Tiger was one of the earliest and most tangible examples of this philosophy. It was a belief that quality could triumph over quantity. But the Second World War was a conflict that brutally disproved this theory. It was a war won by logistics, by industrial capacity, and by the ability to sustain armies in the field over months and years of grinding attrition. The Sherman tank, so often maligned in one-on-one comparisons, was in fact the perfect weapon for this kind of war. It was reliable enough, effective enough, and most importantly, it was available in staggering numbers. Its production was 5 to 6 times cheaper and 10 times faster than that of a Tiger. This meant that the Allies could equip their armies, sustain them through heavy losses, and still have a deep reserve of vehicles and spare parts. They won because their industrial base could absorb the punishment and keep fighting, a luxury Germany did not have. Post-war studies confirmed that the majority of Tiger losses were not attributable to enemy fire. They were lost to mechanical breakdowns, a lack of fuel, and the inability to recover them during retreats. The very complexity and weight that made them formidable also made them fragile from a logistical standpoint. The Tiger demanded a level of support that the German military, squeezed from all sides, simply could not provide in the final years of the war. The legacy of the Tiger, therefore, is a cautionary tale. It serves as a powerful lesson in military history about the difference between tactical effectiveness and strategic relevance. It demonstrates that in a prolonged industrial conflict, the most successful weapon is not always the most powerful, but the most sustainable. The Sherman, for all its individual flaws, was part of a winning system, a system of mass production, robust logistics, combined arms doctrine, and air supremacy. The Tiger, for all its individual brilliance, was part of a failing one. Today, the Tiger tank remains an object of fascination, a symbol of German engineering prowess, and a testament to the extremes of armored vehicle design. The few surviving examples are prized exhibits in museums around the world, their immense size and imposing presence still capable of inspiring awe. But its story is ultimately one of tragedy and misplaced priorities. It was a beautiful, deadly, and ultimately useless weapon in the grand scheme of a war that was decided not by the clash of steel titans on the battlefield, but by the relentless hum of assembly lines thousands of miles away. The final verdict of history is that overwhelming numbers, backed by an unassailable industrial and logistical system, will almost always triumph over a small number of technologically superior, but ultimately unsustainable weapons. The war was won not by the rapier, but by the relentless, crushing weight of the hammer.